long before central heating, Wi-Fi, or corner stores that sell both motor oil and gummy bears. Early settlers faced down winters like miniature epics of survival. These were not polite, cocoa-sipping winters. These were the kinds of winters that rattled the eaves, turned chickens into sherbet sculptures, and made people start conversations with the phrase, "Well, we made it through another night." Picture it, a single-room cabin, smoke curling lazily from a stone chimney, snow blanketing the world outside like the earth itself had grown drowsy and put on a feather bed. Inside, a handful of people, 2 quilts, and 1 cup of tea doing its best to service 4 mouths. Everyone in itchy wool. The secret to surviving these winters wasn't brute strength or endless supplies. They didn't have either. It was tactics. Quiet, clever, often peculiar little tactics passed down like sacred knowledge, or at least like good gossip. One such trick? Window insulation a la la soaked, rags and paper. Lard, famed for its role in pies and cardiac confusion, was also smeared on cloth scraps and stuffed into every imaginable crack, crevice, and thing that shouldn't, by nature, have lard in it. Windows were wondrous inventions, great for light, terrible for warmth. So early folks took to pasting greased paper over the panes. This let in just enough light to avoid kicking the stove during breakfast, and just enough grease to confuse passing squirrels. And then there was the bed. Here, upgrades were not optional. One did not simply tuck in. One was sealed up like a letter. Featherbeds were stacked like lasagna, a layer below, one above, and then additional quilts, coats, and on bad nights, every dog in the household. The family dog was not a pet so much as a heat strategy, a tail-wagging hot water bottle with opinions. It's worth noting, too, that clothes were not changed so much as rotated. Imagine waking up, stepping out of your nightshirt and directly into yesterday's trousers, which sat by the fire like a lazy cat. If you were lucky, the garments were warm. If you were less lucky, they contained a small rodent waiting for the same. Food, of course, was half the struggle. When you can't pop down to the farmer's market and the snow's higher than the cow's dignity, you develop a deep romantic relationship with porridge. Oats were the clingy suitor of the pantry, always there, morning and night. You didn't choose him. He warmed you. Porridge was spiced, salted, buried under molasses if luck allowed, or simply eaten with size, and a spoon fashioned from the previous night's broke shovel. Then there were the warming stones. These river-smoothed little miracles were heated in the fire, wrapped in cloth, and tucked into beds or shoes before wear. Sleep without one, and you'd wake up walking like a chimney sweep in November. Just don't confuse the warming stone with the family's one good potato. That lesson was swift and mushy. Water? Well, when it wasn't frozen mid-air, collecting it was the most treacherous mini-expedition a person could experience. A bucket, a creek, 3 wool layers, and the eternal risk of falling through, said Creek. It was winter's version of going out for milk, except instead of milk, you might not come back. Evenings were long, but not idle. There was spinning, mending, reading aloud, if the pages hadn't frozen together again. Storytelling ruled, and each tale had the familiar rhythm of both entertainment and body heat conservation. You spoke slowly, not for drama, but because your jaw was frozen in place from the walk back with creek water. And yet, there was a kind of magic to it, a stubborn softness. They didn't just survive. They chuckled, made games out of chores, and whispered wool-wrapped lullabies against wooden walls. Survival, back then, wasn't about loud victories. It was about quiet continuity, A new dawn, fresh cornbread, all limbs accounted for. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Let's keep warm with one more whisper of the past. There was a kind of wisdom in being a little bit dull in 17th century colonial America. A useful dullness, not the boring kind your cousin Harold might wield at family dinners, but the sort born of quiet observation and the sheer will to not die in a windswept cabin full of frostbitten potatoes. Picture this. Outside, snow has curled itself into drifts as tall as the moral high ground of a Puritan minister, and inside the air is thick with the scent of smoke, old wool, and whatever suspiciously grey stew is simmering over the hearth. The settler family, 7 to a roof, 4 to a bed, and at least 2 suffering from chilblains, leans heavily on routine and calm-fingered preparation. Spring is months off. Hope is more of a summer activity. Now, you may wonder how exactly these early settlers survived the kind of winters that would make a modern thermostat curl up and cry. The trick, in part, was picking just the right sort of boring. They learned first and fast from the people who'd actually been there longest. Northeastern tribes like the Wampanoag, Abenaki, and Haudenosaunee. These communities, significantly more knowledgeable and substantially less inclined to freeze to death, had long experimented with the art of wintering well. Think pemmican instead of pantry raids, fur lining instead of fashion choices. The settlers took notes, or at least some did. Others preferred to gesture nobly and frostbite promptly. One quiet innovation was insulation via, manure. That's not poetic exaggeration. Settlers occasionally stacked dried dung bricks along the walls of their homes, sealed them with mud, and called it a day. It was earthy, rustic, and quite literally full of character. But it worked. The smell allegedly disappeared once frozen, so the only real suffering happened in the fall and again in the spring, when thawing turned every home into a warm barn with ambitious dreams. Clothing, too, was less about fashion and more about survival. Layers were king. Wool, linen, deerskin, wrapped, tucked, stitched, and sometimes repurposed from whatever hadn't yet succumbed to mildew or mice. Entire families wore the same thick outer garments day and night. Pajamas? There were no pajamas. There was simply the least itchy layer. And mittens. Oh yes, the first mittens were more like finger prisons stitched from leftover wool and stubbornness. Knitted during the handful of daylight hours by candlelight, or while listening to a neighbor drone on about moral virtue, these mittens were traded like currency and revered like small woolen saints. Occasionally, you'd see a thumb poking out, not due to design, but because Martha hadn't had enough lamp oil to finish sewing before dark. And speaking of lamp oil, here is where things got ingenious. Wales, unhappily, had already been roped into colonial lighting schemes, their blubber boiled into precious oil for illumination. But when whale oil ran low, bacon fat stepped in. Settlers carefully saved every glistening drip of grease in small crock pots, floating a rag in the center to create a makeshift candle. You haven't truly known the smell of home until you've fallen asleep to the flickering light of salted pork. The long nights were quiet, too cold to talk much, too dark to do anything productive or entertaining, and too exhausting to argue. So families sat in silence, huddled beneath quilts stuffed with wool, fur, or whatever else they hadn't thrown into the cooking pot. Children clutched hot stones, heated by the hearth and wrapped in corn husks or cloth. Primitive bed warmers passed down with the same ceremony as family. Names. Books were rare, precious, and often terribly written. So when someone could read, they did it slowly, dramatically, savoring each syllable like a dessert. The Bible, an almanac, maybe Pilgrim's Progress if you were lucky. If not, well, there was always making shadows with your hands against the firelight theatre, a deeply underrated art form. It's tempting, from the warm safety of your climate-controlled blanket fort, to imagine that these early colonists were hardier than us. But perhaps they simply had no other choice. Hardship baked creativity into their daily bread, and boredom became its own crucial technology. For while you can't burn ennui for warmth, you can sure stitch it into a mitten. And so, as the snow pressed soft white silence against shuttered windows and the wind rehearsed its howl like a lonely poet, the settlers kept to their woven rhythms, small, dull, brilliant gestures that turned endless winter into something survivable. Of course, there were others who took winter survival one step further. By mastering the mysterious skill of building entire underground food bunkers. Not as dramatic as it sounds, but deeply satisfying all the same. The snow had a tendency to arrive uninvited and stay longer than any welcome could stretch. It would start with a flurry, innocent, even pretty, and then, like an over-eager dinner guest with 10 suitcases, decide to settle in for weeks. For the early settlers, there was no such thing as snow tires or emergency supply runs to the colonial equivalent of a corner shop, unless your corner shop sold 3 crying chickens, a single turnip, and frostbite. When the first storm clouds began to chalk themselves across the sky, the settlers, already disillusioned with how fresh the so-called New World actually was, knew they had about a day or two before the world congealed into ice and despair, so they scurried into action. Preparation, you see, was their not-so-secret strategy. You didn't get points for style in 1691, but you did earn the basic privilege of surviving into spring, which was considered quite fashionable. First came the firewood. Always the firewood. Piles of split logs were stacked by cabin walls with the frenetic desperation of people who had once spent a night without heat and still had emotional flashbacks every time someone said, "brrr." The average settler needed roughly 40 cartloads of wood to last the winter. The overachievers chopped at least twice that, just to stay humble. Yet it wasn't simply the firewood's presence, but its personality that mattered. You wanted dry, uncomplaining wood, not moist, sulky planks that hissed and sputtered in the hearth, like they were offended by the notion of combustion. Ash, maple, and oak were favorites, though maple made people hungry because it always faintly smelled of pancakes when burned. This was a cruel irony, as they were out of flour by December. Inside the modest, drafty cabins, constructed from hand-sawn beams, prayer, and the occasional missing nail, life became about careful choreography. Settlers developed a kind of snowside ballet simply to move around each other without triggering a cascade of boiling stew, snapping floorboards, or the collapse of a sleeping baby wrapped like a human cabbage. The hearth, without exaggeration, was the soul of the home, not just for warmth, but for cooking, storytelling, drying mittens, boiling questionable roots into even more questionable tea, and providing just enough light for Grandpa Elijah to remember his grievances, but not enough to write another letter of complaint to the crown. Again. To pass their time indoors, settlers turned to what we might today call recreational chores: spinning wool, making candles, repairing tools. It was the 17th century version of binge-watching craft tutorials, only mandatory and with frostbitten fingers. They'd also engage in the lost art of doing absolutely nothing while looking miserably heroic about it. Sitting quietly by the fire, perhaps peeling an apple in dramatic silence, was seen as a show of patience and strength. Some of the more theatrical types could make one apple last an entire afternoon, which in those days was considered emotional endurance. Speaking of apples, those who had the foresight, and frankly optimism, to plant apple trees years beforehand, now reap the reward in the form of wrinkly little fruits, stored snugly in barrels of straw. They'd been carefully turned all season to prevent bruising, an act that was less about culinary necessity and more about keeping busy without having existential crises before breakfast. Families often shared one bed to conserve warmth, which created space challenges but saved considerable misery. Layer upon layer of quilts, woven by hand, every stitch humming with months of whispered gossip. Cocoon parents, siblings, a disgruntled hound, and whatever strange-looking cousin had wandered over before the snow trapped him in. And then there was the window, singular. A small rectangle of oiled parchment that responded to weather changes with the enthusiastic cracking sounds of cheap suspense fiction. Peering out from it in winter was less about checking the forecast, which was always still snow, and more about contemplating the eternal question of when one might next see grass. But despite the hardship, despite the chills that reached intimacy levels usually reserved for weddings, the early settlers developed a rhythm, a quiet survival. There was comfort in understanding that nothing lasted forever, not even winter, hopefully. Somewhere between candlelight shadows and the groaning of wind against hand-built walls, they found peace, maybe even magic. And just as their minds began to soften into the warm haze of sleep or stew fumes, the two being occasionally indistinguishable, something remarkable happened. They remembered it was almost time for the snowshoes. Winter, historically, has always been less about snow angels and more about not dying, especially for early settlers who faced snowdrifts tall enough to qualify as accidental architecture, and nights so long they may have personally insulted the sun. But nestled within these frigid chapters of the past are quiet tricks that, while humble, were thus far undefeated. For instance, take the art of window insulation. Modern folk might default to double-glazed efficiency or a heated, judgmental stare at their thermostat. But back in the 17th and 18th centuries, early colonists and pioneers had a simpler solution. They nailed blankets over the windows, or, for the particularly cultured, pasted parchment soaked in oil over the openings. This let light in while pretending the wind didn't exist. It was, in essence, the lifestyle equivalent of squinting through greasy wax paper and hoping your eyelashes didn't frost over indoors. Of course, these moments of ingenuity weren't limited to hardware. The settlers developed an entire psychological infrastructure made of resignation, faith, and bread. Especially bread. Flour was life. And when flour was short, which was often once the roads were buried under 16 layers of your oxen won't make it, the settlers got creative. They made brown bread from cornmeal, rye, and molasses, steamed in kettles, and generally the consistency of a stump with good intentions. It filled the belly, and perhaps more importantly, gave the illusion that you still controlled some small piece of your fate, one chewy slice at a time. Clothing was another battlefield. Layering wasn't a fashion choice, it was a strategy. Settlers would wear wool shifts, linen underthings, several layers of skirts or breeches, and then pile on coats lined with animal fur, often from beavers, foxes, or the occasional squirrel with poor timing. Fashion in those winters was dictated entirely by what can I sew onto myself today that isn't currently frozen to the clothesline. Even with all that preparation, the place to truly survive a colonial winter was at the hearth. The fireplace wasn't just a source of heat. It was a theatre, a gossip hub, a cooking school, and, in the dead of winter, an existential anchor. Settlers would keep the fire going through the night by banking the coals, saving heat under ashes like a secret handshake passed from dusk to dawn. Waking up to a warm hearth in January was a small miracle, ranking somewhere just below the cow not kicking over the milk bucket, and just above finding a whole onion that hadn't fallen asleep for the winter. And speaking of onions, nothing stirred the heart or the digestive system like winter soups. Thick broths made from dried beans, salted pork, and root vegetables that had the consistency of confident gravel. In some households, the communal soup pot was never fully emptied. Each day's stew began with whatever was left from yesterday, creating, over time, a flavor profile best described as ancestral. But perhaps most charming and most curious was the settler tradition of storytelling as survival. As snow rendered the world puffy and soundless, entire families would huddle near the fire and pass the endless evenings with tales of old Europe, wandering spirits, and wildly implausible local legends. Some say the cold made the stories better, or perhaps, more likely, it simply made the listeners too chilled to leave. There's a comfort in how slowly the winter days passed, how people measured time not by the hour, but by how many knots in your boots refroze. And when night arrived, as it did early and without apology, there was little choice but to wind down with the snow. Little did the settlers know that among all these small gestures of endurance, baking bittersweet bread, layering squirrel-lined cloaks, nursing eternal stew, and fluffing stories near the fire, they were building something quite rare, a kind of cozy defiance, not glamorous, not grand, just enough warmth, craft, and camaraderie to outlast the storm. And as morning stretched slowly across the frost-painted windows, another quiet trick emerged, perhaps the cleverest of all. But we'll drift gently there, in due time. Winter, for the early settlers, was less a season and more a house guest that overstayed its welcome, refused to speak English, and ate all the root vegetables. Starting somewhere after the first frost, and ending just about the time someone called out, "Hey, was that a butterfly?" These long, biting months tested not only the strength of the settlers' log homes, but also the strength of their senses of humor. And despite history books often depicting them with stoic expressions and stiff woolen collars, rest assured, many settlers were absolutely hilarious out of sheer necessity. A blistering nor'easter could lay siege to a homestead for 3 weeks straight, and it turns out nothing gets cabin fever stirring like 8 people trying to share one fireplace, 2 spoons, and 1 opinionated goat. But when nature turned up the volume outside, hurling snow sideways and freezing the will to live, they had survival tricks that were more ingenious than dramatic. No flares, no Morse code, no shirtless men chopping logs in slow motion, just quiet persistence wrapped in flannel. Inside these creaking, snow-blanketed cabins, the first and most sacred winter trick was layering. But not layering as we know it today, with sleek thermal materials and performance fleece. No, they were layering garments that were essentially wearable furniture. Heavy wool shirts, doubled-up stockings, petticoats over underpetticoats, and, if you fancy it, maybe a small lapdog tucked into your waistband for abdominal warmth. The goal was simple: trap every molecule of warmth like it was gold dust. The result? A society perpetually dressed like it was 13 minutes into a nap. Boots, of course, were necessities, but remember, this was before left and right shoes were invented. That's right. Settlers had what historians call straight-last footwear, one universal boot shape, to be shared equally between left and right feet, because early Americans didn't have time to argue with their shoes. They just sort of hoped their feet would adapt, or they'd wear them into submission. It gave a whole new meaning to breaking in your boots. Now, while some settlers huddled near the hearth, others were quietly getting creative with how to make use of every last ember of warmth. One lesser-known trick involved what was called a bed warmer. A metal pan filled with hot coals slid under the bed covers prior to sleep. The idea was to gently roast your sheets until they felt less like a frozen tarp. Provided, of course, you didn't poke a hole in the mattress or overdo the coals and wake up flambéed, which did happen, albeit rarely, and those who survived the experience had to live with the tragic nickname of Smoky. Food preservation in these endless winters became a kind of culinary origami. Salt pork was a staple, and by staple, I mean both essential and genuinely chewable, only if you had jaw muscles like an ox. Everything was salted, smoked, pickled, or stored in barrels with a vague hope and some prayer. Molasses was prized. It didn't freeze ever, and this fact alone gave it quirky status as the MVP of the winter pantry. Families would ration it like liquid treasure, and occasionally use it as barter, adhesive, or emotional support syrup. Of course, one of the more ingenious, if less appetizing survival tricks was the creation of hardtack, a biscuit so firm it made concrete blush. Made from flour, salt, and whatever dreams were left of soft food, hardtack was baked until it could outlive time itself. Soldiers during the Revolution often joked it was better used as a paperweight or possibly armor. Settlers, ever adaptable, soaked it in broth, tea, or even water collected from melted icicles just to make it chewable. Some say each piece had to be softened for at least 25 minutes, or the risk of dental shrapnel was simply too high. Music, too, played its role, if not in survival, then in maintaining sanity. Fiddles were popular, especially as they could be played indoors, with dance being out of the question unless you wanted to bump into 8 coats drying on hooks. Music was usually accompanied by toe tapping that barely stirred the packed snow on the floor. And since every crevice in the log cabin seemed to either whistle or howl with the wind, a bit of fiddling served as both entertainment and acoustic exorcism. All the while, outside, the snow kept falling. It softened the landscape like a quilt the size of the world. Settlers would take turns peeking through the frost-blurred windows, wondering if spring was a myth or merely late again. And as night settled once more over the windswept roofs and quietly steaming chimneys, another small survival ritual began: the checking of wool socks, the pulling tight of bed quilts, and the whispered promise that tomorrow someone might finally find the missing bean pot. Beyond the snowbanks, concealed perhaps behind a groaning drift or the low call of an owl, a glimmer of the settler's next survival mystery was waiting. Still, quiet, and oddly lined with bark. In the still silence of the early colonial night, long before the electric buzz of thermostats or the friendly hum of a microwave, there was another kind of warmth, handmade, humble, and a touch smoky. And while the snow drifted high against stout little cabins, piling like lazy thoughts around doorways and up windowsills, settlers embraced one of their boldest survival strategies yet: getting through winter by not freezing their toes off. or any other parts, preferably. It was a meticulous ballet, a choreography of fire, wool, and wildly unreasonable optimism. The fag hearth was the undisputed monarch of the household, and the fire, a fickle, crackling deity to be worshipped closely, not just for warmth, but for cooking, drying wet mittens that had aspirations to be dry mittens again, and occasionally thawing out a sleepy chicken someone had accidentally let inside. Settler homes were not, shall we say, airtight. Drafts were as common as opinions and had a special talent for finding your knees just when you were starting to believe you were warm. But even cut from the same cloth of hardship, not all homes were created equal. The luckiest of settlers had double pen log cabins, basically 2 log rooms with a breezeway in between, designed to keep cool in summer, but in winter, that breezeway became a corridor of Arctic doom. Naturally, they stuffed it with everything from hay bales to hanging meat to unfortunate in-laws who had overstayed their welcome. A very multifunctional architecture. Inside, clothing wasn't just a matter of fashion. It was a matter of survival and layers. So many layers, underlayers, overlayers, and what we call now blanket chic. Early settlers would bundle up in woolen shifts and undergarments made from linen so homespun it still smelled vaguely of goats. Over that came petticoats, waistcoats, breeches, and sometimes more breeches for warmth. Did it look graceful? No, but neither does hypothermia. One of the settlers' oldest tricks for maintaining body heat at night was the noble bed warmer. These weren't passionate love letters or particularly affectionate husbands, no, though those were nice too, but rather oddly menacing metal pans with long handles. Heated over the fire and then tucked under the bedsheets, they lent the illusion of a warm mattress without the actual need to cuddle a live bear. Of course, hot water bottles made cameo appearances as well. Made from stoneware bottles or, in some cases, cleverly repurposed ale flasks, cheers to innovation. They became the most beloved bedtime companions of the colonial era, second only perhaps to those willing to take the outer edge of the bed closest to the window. Food was another survival trick, though a less glamorous one come February. By then, the garden was just a frozen dream under 3 feet of snow, and meals took on a sort of culinary monotony rivaled only by particularly strict monasteries. But a smart settler had spent autumn salting, smoking, pickling, and drying like a mad scientist with a cabbage-based agenda. Salt pork was a specialty, thick, fatty slabs preserved like precious treasure and rendered into stews so hearty they could legally be classified as walls. Root vegetables like turnips and carrots fared decently in cool cellars, tucked into straw or sawdust like sleepy, rooty gnomes waiting out the season. And if you were really savvy or incredibly desperate, you might have indulged in some pemmican, a Native American marvel of preserved meat, rendered fat and dried, berries. It looked a bit like candle wax and tasted like ambition. But perhaps the warmest secret of all was the winter circle, the tradition of gathering close in the evenings, whether around a fire, a sturdy table, or a spinning wheel. Parents spun stories while children spun wool, and while the wind rattled outside like a tired ghost with poor timing, life simply quieted into these rhythms of survival and togetherness. It wasn't glamorous, but it was grace, in its quietest, most practical form. Some even shared heat directly, thanks to a practice called bundling, a chaste but surprisingly effective custom where 2 young folks interested in a little courtship might be wrapped separately, but snuggled side by side under one impressively quilted blanket. Whether it was a family-sanctioned love story or just an economically heated nap has been debated by historians and former bundlers alike. And so, with clever layers, glowing hearths, and just enough salted pork to wish for spring, the settlers tucked themselves into winter like a reluctant nap. But their ingenuity didn't stop at dressing warmly or sealing windows with whatever they hadn't already eaten. Because when snow blocked the barns, and fetching water meant becoming a temporary snowman, their next quiet genius kicked in, harnessing the power of nature itself as a refrigerator. But that, dear dreamer, comes with its own frosty tale. By the time snow had sealed the world into its annual silence, early settlers were already deploying their most underestimated winter survival tactic, getting astonishingly good at sitting still. Now, this may sound unimpressive, but try sitting still for 14 hours in front of a fire made of damp pine logs while the wind argues loudly with the shutters. Add to that a diet generously dependent on root vegetables and the occasional excitement of moulding lard into candles that would, at best, smell like bacon that lost a bet. And one begins to appreciate the psychological stamina behind sitting still in 18th century winter. The settlers called it wintering in, though hibernating suspiciously awake might have been a little more accurate. See, once the flurry of autumn prep ended, wood chopped, root cellar stocked, goats firmly reminded not to chew the roof, the real trick wasn't just delivering enough calories, but surviving the months in tight quarters without becoming a footnote in someone else's crime novel. Cabins, for all their loggish charm, were not spacious. The average structure was about 12 feet by 20, which is roughly the size of a modern suburban guest bathroom. Into this space went two parents, anywhere from 3 to 11 children, half of whom mysteriously materialized each winter, several chickens, a borderline heroic dog, and sometimes a pig with elite cuddling credentials. Walls were more suggestive than structural, and windows, glass being a luxury, were often cunningly upgraded patches of oiled paper, so they had to invent peace. One of the quietest survival secrets was built into the daily rhythms, tasks with slow purposes and satisfying sounds. For instance, carding wool, a deeply repetitive activity involving 2 parts wool, 1 part rhythm, and a dash of existential reflection. The crick-crick of carding paddles became winter's background music, closely followed by monotonous, meditative spinning wheels that whirred like bees on a warm June day you hadn't felt since October. And then there was storytelling. Evenings were for oral history, passed down alongside spoonfuls of stew and increasingly vague memories of fresh vegetables. This was less about preserving history than about preserving sanity. A good story could stretch longer than daylight, weaving together real events, spectral invaders, moral lessons, and heavy-handed allegories about what happened to kids who didn't sweep out the hearth. Things got very detailed. One memorable tale from a Maine settler in the 1770s involved a talking raccoon who ran for mayor and banned winter entirely. The story required no fewer than 4 narrators and apparently a hand puppet made of beaver fur. Truth, optional. Entertainment value, crucial. Meanwhile, another under-celebrated winter tactic was the strategic use of naps. Daylight in northern latitudes was microscopic. Some winters, you'd be lucky to get 6 hours before night came back around like a persistent door-to-door theology student. So settlers took naps, morning naps, afternoon naps, pre-dinner, just resting my eyes naps. And most effective of all, segmented sleep, a pattern common before the Industrial Revolution. folks would sleep in two distinct phases, with a waking hour or two in the middle that they often used for light odd jobs, quiet conversation, or praying that the roof didn't collapse under the snow. And speaking of that roof, settlers learned the subtle art of snow relief shoveling. Not outside, oh no. Every few days someone would draw the short straw and scurry up onto the roof with a wooden shovel, carefully unburdening the logs before they bowed any farther under winter's smug insistence. It was dangerous, cold, and wildly unpopular, but very effective, which to settlers was reason enough. Culinary creativity also shone in these long months. You'd be surprised what a person can do with dried apples, molasses, and creative overconfidence. One Vermont settler wrote of her deep winter pie that included jerky, dried cherries, and a crust made entirely from rendered bear fat and crushed acorns. A hit with no one, but deeply calorific, another kind of survival altogether. And through it all, settlers developed what might be the most quietly brilliant survival trick, the ability to look outside at an unbroken wilderness of ice and see not desolation, but calm. The gale howled, the cold argued, but inside a fire crackled, wool crept into blankets, and stories spun like snowflakes, landing softly on eager ears. Soon the snowbanks would flirt with the windowsill again, and a rooster would attempt optimism sometime around what used to be dawn. But for now, in this soft fortress of stillness and soot, the wintering in continued, quietly, cleverly, and with just the right amount of pie. And somewhere beneath the snow-covered eaves, plans were already stirring. Slow, sleepy, practical plans for the next icy challenge. How to wash exactly one outfit when it's too cold to blink outdoors. It's easy to forget from the comfort of a heated home and Wi-Fi that once upon a frostbitten time, staying alive through winter was a full-time job. Somewhat less about peppermint cocoa and more about not freezing to death in your socks. As snow piled past window panes and the wind scolded the landscape like a cranky librarian shushing the earth itself, early settlers turned inward, literally and figuratively, into their log homes, burrows of hope and sheer necessity. And it was inside those wooden wombs of creaking timber and smoked bacon humidity that one of their most marvelous winter survival tools arose, the economy of warmth. The principle was simple. In winter, you treated heat like royalty, and your house like a kingdom under siege. No venting, no wasting, and absolutely no opening the front door unless a bear was knocking, preferably one offering firewood. First came the great furniture migration, in which chairs, stools, and entire sleeping arrangements edged closer to the central hearth in careful territorial advances. Those lucky enough to own a cast-iron stove became the favoured noblemen of the season, while the less fortunate gathered around fire pits with a patience cultivated by frostbite and the smell of someone's bread burning slightly again. Now, the real quiet artistry of winter resilience lay not in what you did while awake, but what you did asleep. Because when the nights crept in like a wool-draped bear and temperatures plunged lower than a snake's morals, settlers didn't merely wrap themselves in blankets. No, they subscribed to an ancient wisdom that could be best described as competitive layering. We're not just talking quilts here. We're talking fur on flannel on homespun wool, stitched together with guilt for complaining, and maybe just a dash of raccoon. One early New England family recorded in a weather journal, because that's what you did before Netflix, noted that come February, they had so many layers on the bed that it took a lever and pulley system to peel off in the morning. One child reportedly vanished in the folds and wasn't found until the spring thaw. He was perfectly fine, made a hobby of singing to the mice. Clothing, too, took on a kind of hibernative function. Your night clothes weren't just pajamas. They were battle armor. A Union suit, those famous red flannel onesies with the comically inconvenient rear flap, wasn't a fashion statement unless you consider survival of the frostiest high fashion. And mittens. Ah, glorious mittens. Settlers old and young wore them even indoors, often repurposing old sweaters into not-so-convincing hand covers. There's record of a Massachusetts family cutting finger holes into potatoes, slipping them on like gloves, and warming them by the fire first. Innovation or snack emergency? Tough to say. Another invaluable strategy for nocturnal survival: shared body heat. A quaint euphemism before central heating was 3 dogs' night, meaning it was cold enough to need not one, but 3 dogs in your bed to make it through till dawn. Don't worry, listeners. This arrangement was cozy, not canine chaos. The dogs knew the drill. Curl up, don't bark, and maybe you get a piece of biscuit as a bonus. And if you didn't have dogs, well, you had family. Cousins, siblings, and that uncle who smelled perpetually of molasses and regret. Everyone squeezed into one bed. Privacy vanished somewhere with the autumn geese, but in return, everyone shared jokes, warmth, and on occasion, head lice. Maybe not everything was worth sharing. The rooms themselves, of course, joined the effort. Windows were sealed with cloth and the homemade putty. Often flour and water because, you guessed it, everything had to multitask, including your baking supplies. Gaps in the log walls welcomed the artistry of chinking. A mixture of mud, moss, and hope smeared into every crevice. It wasn't perfect, but it did keep the worst of the wind out and the loudest of the squirrels in. In the corners of the home, winter theatres of patience unfolded. Card games by candlelight, scripture recitations, the occasional reading aloud of a 10-year-old almanac as though it held secrets, mostly weather predictions and pumpkin planting tips. But at night, when it was quietest, you could hear the true rhythm of winter survival. The creak of shifting wood beams, the sigh of a dozing dog, and the slow, contented breathing of a family surviving together, deeply layered and held in place by time, trust, and a steamy loaf of turnip bread, wrapped in rags at the foot of the bed, still faintly warm. And somewhere, in that immersive silence, another trick whispered through the boards, one that had nothing to do with layers, logs, or livestock. It lived up high, in the attic lofts and snow-dusted eaves, where settlers stored not only food, but something far more inventive. By the time January winds began playing long, ghostly tunes through cracked chimney stones, early settlers had already started their quiet symphony of survival. Life outside the walls was a swirling performance of snowflakes and frostbite. But indoors, indoors was a different world entirely, where clever thinking met woolen socks and mulled apple peels in a dance of determined coziness. One such invention of anti-winter genius was the aptly named Dutch oven. Imported, adapted, and occasionally misunderstood, this thick-walled cooking pot was less of a kitchen accessory and more of a domestic companion. Settlers used Dutch ovens not only to bake bread or stew, whatever game hadn't yet outsmarted their traps, but also as a source of radiant heat. A properly loaded Dutch oven could warm both a pot of venison and the calloused fingers stirring it. A double benefit that made it the crown jewel of every frostbitten homestead. Of course, cooking in winter was part meal prep, part theatre. Kitchens filled with misty clouds of boiling water the windows fogging so thickly that children sometimes used their fingernails to draw heroic tales in the condensation, usually involving an anthropomorphized pig named Sir Porkalot, who battled icicle dragons with beef stew. Outdoors, snow-buried fences, carts, and the occasional overly ambitious goat. But indoors, the settlers spun ingenious routines to make the long nights less of an ordeal and more of a performance. Evening, chores became rituals. Lamps were checked and lit with the reverence of a sacred rite. Candles were carefully rationed, trimmed, and placed where shadows couldn't sneak up under door frames. Speaking of door frames, some settlers resorted to what you might call architectural knitting. If a draft snuck through, it would find itself blocked by heavy curtains, stuffed gunny sacks, or, in one spectacular case, a taxidermied raccoon named Cedric, who bravely guarded the back window through 14 winters, and at least 2 generations of local children daring each other to pet him. But it wasn't just heat they conserved, it was energy too. By the 3rd week of winter, most settlers had developed what we would now call hibernation hobbies. Spinning wool wasn't just productive, it was rhythmic, soothing, and oddly competitive. Embroidery contests popped up unannounced, often with rules as mysterious as the judges' scoring criteria. Someone always lost for overly ambitious stitch work, whatever that meant. Evenings were for storytelling, of course, an activity that occupied the hands, the minds, and sometimes the chickens, who were known to sneak inside and roost near the fire, listening in as if hoping to hear they were cast as heroines rather than dinner. The tales themselves drifted between historical and hysterical. There were solemn retellings of the crossing of oceans, of storms and survival, and very unhelpful goats. But there were also stories of romantic meteorologists, haunted privies, and one particularly infamous incident involving a squirrel, a butter churn, and the local pastor's unmentionables. Perhaps the most delightful of indoor winter tricks, though, was the invention of the foot warmer. These were small metal boxes filled with embers, essentially portable fireplaces you could slide under a blanket or, in daring cases, under a carriage seat. Well-bundled families might set off across town, with their toasty contraption nestled beneath their feet, giving the illusion of luxury even during snow squalls severe enough to make travel seem like a bad idea drafted by a house cat. At night, when activities slowed and the wind howled like a determined aunt trying to sell you homemade salves, families turned to another revered item, the bed warmer. This was a long-handled pan filled with coals, slipped between the sheets before bedtime. Care was required, of course, unless one hoped to begin the year by accidentally lighting the duvet on fire. And so, winter evenings became sketches in firelight and the soft scratch of wool against wool. People drew close, spoke softly, shared laughter like it was currency, and trusted their quiet wisdom to see them through another blizzard. The storm howled outside, but inside, Sherpa-lined ingenuity wrapped around the heart like a down comforter made of human patience and mild sarcasm. And as these wintry rituals continued, some practical, some peculiar, some suspiciously, involving raccoons, they all pointed toward one simple truth: that warmth wasn't just about fire. It was about staying clever, staying patient, and, when necessary, making friends with a chicken by the hearth. Outside, the sky waited to clear, the snow to melt, and the seeds to wake. But not yet. First, there was still silence to savor, and perhaps a final mug of something mulled, sipped in the glow of stories that only candles remember. Which leads us quietly, like snow settling on wool, to the most unusual musical traditions settlers used to stir up joy amid the frost. By the time January had fully unpacked her icy suitcases and settled into the valleys and cabins of early settler land, the snow no longer bothered warning anyone. It simply arrived, thick as butter and utterly uninterested in your plans. Yet, despite the deepening drifts and days spent in shadow, our clever colonial friends had a secret. They were masters of doing absolutely nothing. With remarkable flair, winter survival demanded not just grit, but a commitment to the fine art of stillness. Settlers discovered early on that once your chores were done, and they were always done before the sun sulked off to the horizon at 4 in the afternoon, the best way to preserve calories, sanity, and diplomatic relations with your nearest relation was to sit very, very quietly. Families passed whole evenings in a grand shared silence punctuated only by the occasional sound of knitting needles, the creaking of pine logs settling in the fire, and the universal winter pastime, staring deeply and quite meaningfully into the middle distance. Of course, not everyone was content to simply freeze in dignified tranquility. Some dared to innovate. Among the lesser-known inventions of the time was the draft dodger, a long, sausage-shaped cushion stuffed with old rags to keep the cold wind from slithering underneath doors. If you've never met a settler who treated their draft dodger like a beloved pet, you've never visited a real winter cabin. They were named, sewn in calico, and sometimes tucked in for the night. But even still, the cold found a way in, whispering through the knotholes and keyholes and floorboards. So settlers learned to layer not just themselves, but their homes. Windows were covered with oiled paper or rabbit hide curtains. The notion of wearing your coat indoors wasn't a sign of indifference to fashion. It was a life strategy. And in evening gatherings, it was not uncommon for every member of the family, from Aunt Tabitha down to the family goat, to be draped in shawls knitted from what can only be described as the wool of profoundly disgruntled sheep. Nighttime was its own sport. Sleeping arrangements followed a complex family formula. Who snored loudest, who had the most heat to spare, and which cousin was likely to kick a sibling mid-dream. It was widely accepted that the warmest spot was smack in the middle of the bed, squashed between 2 radiators of human origin. If you were lucky, the dog wormed its way in at the footboard, adding 4-legged warmth and a dash of flea-driven drama. And just when things got a little too cozy, the roof might let out a great, thunderous sigh, not of weather, but of the snow settling under its own existential weight. Every home developed its own distinct groan, a sound that signaled the slow thaw, or simply another log needed to be thrown onto the fire. These noises became familiar lullabies, less alarming over time than oddly reassuring, like a querulous old aunt muttering in her sleep. To pass the darker months, settlers didn't fill the silence with boredom, they filled it with story. Long, winding tales that began somewhere around a bear sighting and took 7 days to finish, detouring through births, barn dances, and ghosts who sulked in the pantry. Children would listen wide-eyed, believing that Great Uncle Silas had once arm-wrestled the northern wind into submission and that Great Aunt Mercy invented mittens when she tried to knit in her sleep. These exaggerated epics were insulation for the soul. They didn't just warm the room. They tethered you to memory and mischief, and reminded even the littlest listener that endurance could come with a laugh tucked in its pocket. Outside, the winds kept doing what they did best: howl without explanation. Inside, humans kept mastering the sacred tradition of outlasting the winter not with muscle, but with patience. slippers, a few good sentences, and, if fate allowed, a pantry that still had molasses. After all, winter was never something to conquer. It was something to outwit. And in one remarkably clever farmhouse not too far from the edge of the wilderness, someone was about to brew something most unusual to do just that. A mysterious winter remedy that both confused raccoons and delighted children. As the snow piled higher against their cabin doors and the frost etched lacy thorns across the inside of the windows, early settlers knew, without any meteorologists or Doppler radar, that winter wasn't just visiting, it was moving in, dragging its icy suitcase behind it, and nobody was quite sure when it would decide to leave. And so, tucked beneath fur-lined hoods and behind walls of stacked firewood, the settlers turned to one of their most underrated winter survival tools, doing absolutely nothing. Well, not nothing exactly, but a version of minimalism that would make even the most austere modern wellness influencer look fussy. This was the season of slow, of strategic stillness. You see, in winter, calories were currency, and expending too many of them, say, by ambitiously jogging through waist-high snow to check on how many icicles formed on your neighbor's barn, was a gambler's move. Instead, people learned from nature. Bears hibernated, trees withdrew their sap. Settlers adopted a mode of living somewhere between low power mode and soft pretzel. Long hours were spent around the hearth, the flickering fire casting sleepy shadows on the log walls. Families told stories, often exaggerated, and children were encouraged to sit still and listen, not because it was polite, but because bouncing around used up precious warmth and energy. You didn't just stay still for comfort. Sometimes you stayed still for survival. Meals were deliberately paced, as if digestion itself were an act of fortitude. There was a kind of reverence for porridge that modern diners would struggle to grasp. A warm bowl of anything, eaten slowly, could be a minor religious experience. Bit by bit, the body was fed and the spirit soothed. But of course, humans are terrible at boredom. Even in 1713. So came the crafts, the quiet arts, passed from frosty fingers to frostier ears. By candlelight, settlers mended socks with darning eggs, carved spoons from stubborn hickory, or sewed quilt patches with such dedication you'd think they were embroidering state secrets. These weren't merely hobbies. Needle and thread didn't just pass the time, they stitched meaning into the quiet. A loop here, a knot there, and suddenly the long, dark night had shape. Patterns like flying geese or log cabin didn't just keep you warm, they kept you sane. Strange how needles, whether knitting or sewing, became lifelines during the deep freeze. And let us not forget the auditory amusements, songs that weren't so much sung as hummed, murmured from one drowsy soul to another, like lullabies for grown folk. You might not remember all the words to that old Scottish ballad, but if you could croon just enough of the melody while shelling dried beans, your brain felt entertained. And in a cabin where the most exciting sight might be frost creeping over a floorboard, a tune, even a half-forgotten one, was emotional caffeine. Sometimes, when the wind howled too loudly or the fire refused to cooperate, someone might read aloud from a book, likely the Bible or an almanac, or invent a fictional tale so strikingly inaccurate that it could have passed for King Arthur fan fiction. This wasn't about fact-checking. This was myth-making to fend off the cold. And in the spirit of doing everything a little more slowly, a little more deliberately, settlers took their sweet time with even the most basic domestic tasks. Candle making became a meditative process. Butter churning was a group affair involving song and synchronized sighs. Time was a woolen blanket, stretched just enough to get to the other side of the storm. Even sleep itself was done in rounds. Yes, there was something called first sleep and second sleep. After going to bed not long after sunset, because illumination was expensive and insomnia wasn't trendy yet, many people awoke for an hour or two in the dead middle of the night. They might tend to the fire, whisper to one another, check on a snoring sibling, or stare thoughtfully into the dark as if of pondering life's riddles, like why snow always finds a way into your boots, no matter how tightly they're laced. Then, after a bit of this nocturnal intermission, it was back to bed for second sleep, a soothing reminder that even rest was allowed 2 acts, like a theatre piece performed beneath buffalo hides. It was the subtle things that got them through, knowing when to move and when to be still, when to ration salt and when to sprinkle it over a roasted parsnip like confetti, in celebration of surviving another blizzard. And as the fire hissed gently in the hearth, casting wavy golden shadows on the faces of the weary but warm, the winter marched on outside, none the wiser that the humans inside had turned quiet into a strategy. From this soft fortress of stillness, a new kind of winter wisdom was beginning to unfold, like steam rising from a mug of something warm and sweet. By the time the fireplace had crackled its last log and the stew had stewed into a thick and mysterious paste only answerable to the surname "What's Left," early settlers turned to one of their most curious winter survival tactics, the art of doing absolutely nothing exceptionally well. In modern times, we might call it hibernation mode or seasonal affective lounging. But back in the low sun days of, say, 1673, the pioneers of New England had a quieter approach to getting through the long, snow-trapped months. They called it January. There was an unspoken wisdom amongst those wooden walls. Energy burned in idleness is energy still saved. And so, they developed routines so deeply unactive, you'd think they were invented by the inventor of not inventing anything. For instance, let us consider the curious phenomenon of the bed day. When temperatures dropped low enough to argue with the laws of comfort, entire families often remained in bed from dusk until not quite dawn, but close enough. Tossing logs into the hearth during night watches was important work and often rotated, but otherwise. The day was spent under fur coverings, wrapped tighter than a puritanical conscience. Husbands, wives, children, even visiting neighbors, if they timed their visit poorly or cleverly enough, stacked like so many slices of modest humanity beneath wool, pelts, and the communal understanding that toes were to remain absolutely off limits. For warmth, yes, but also for sanity. Toe touching, after all, could easily start a scuffle in a family-sized burrito of boredom. Talk was light, soft, and often absurd. Someone might recall a poem, or invent one on the spot, with all seriousness and no rhyme whatsoever. Others passed the time telling tales of summers that seemed impossible now. Tales of berry picking, reckless fishing, and a time the cow wandered off and came back on its own. That story was worth at least 8 retellings before mid-February. Between bouts of near napping and slow blinking at the ceiling beams, winter folks also engaged in what could be cheekily called textiles-based existentialism. No, they didn't call it that, but we will, because spinning and mending, threading and knitting, these were not just necessary skills. They were half meditation, half defiant protest against the boredom. Each stitch whispered, "No, I haven't completely given up. Although yes, I might knit this mitten into a sleeve again." And food. The quiet drama of food conservation. Cellars were full of what could be stored, but variety was, let's say, negotiable. A family might dine on cornbread so many times it was rumoured to sneak out at night and plot rebellion with the root vegetables. Meal planning was dictated by one rule. Is it still chewable? If yes, it was dinner. If no, it was soup. And if it was neither, best to leave it outside for the raccoons, who, much like teenage boys, found anything vaguely edible to be positively gourmet. Time passed slowly, like molasses in January, which is, funnily enough, precisely when molasses was best harvested. Cold temperatures thickened the sticky substance, making it easier to store and less inclined to sprint through the pantry, like it would one fateful day in 1919, when it would star in the Great Boston Molasses Flood. But that is a tale for another night. Amongst all this stillness, there was also the peculiar pastime of listening to the weather. Not checking it, not reading it, oh heavens no, but simply listening. The wind against the walls, the soft tap of snow on the shutters, the creaks and groans of pine wood contracting in icy protest. These were lullabies to pioneers, nature's ASMR, long before anyone created a playlist for it. Occasionally, one might crack open the frost-bitten door to peer at the world and confirm it was still buried in white. These peaks often lasted less than a breath, as the cold was quick to remind them why they hadn't left yet. Still snow, they'd report, still cold, and then settle back under the quilts with the slight satisfaction of having done, well, something. It wasn't exciting, but that was the point. Winter didn't ask for triumph. It asked for patience, layers, and a steady supply of dried beans. And in between those long hours of barely doing anything at all, they had something else too. Stories. Made up ones, remembered ones, borrowed ones. Because when the world outside forgets about colour and movement, the mind steps in with both. Speaking of stories, there was one particularly unusual game. A superbly silent contest involving a string, a candle, and the family cat that made its rounds through smaller settlements. But to understand it fully, one must first meet the cleverest grandmother north of Albany, who kept secrets in her stocking and made tea from pine needles and trickery alike, while the snow howled with the enthusiasm of a banshee in wool mittens. Early settlers often found that winter wasn't simply survived, it was outwitted, outlasted, and occasionally tricked altogether. And among the more curious methods in their repertoire was a strategy few today would think to try: fat. And I don't just mean eating it, though heavens did they. Lard had an almost spiritual presence in many colonial pantries. It lubricated skillets, lamp wicks, conversation topics, and, presumably, arteries. But settlers also used fat in ways that would surprise your average modern meteorologist. One such technique was the creation of tallow bed warmers. Hand-sized pouches of hardened animal fat wrapped delicately in cloth, warmed near the fire, and slipped under icy bed covers to slowly release heat through the night. Yes, they basically cuddled with bacon. And honestly, who among us can say we wouldn't? Inside their log cabins, quaint, sure, but as insulated as a basket, weary souls devised layer upon layer of warmth. Drafts wormed their way in through every gap in the timber, so settlers stuffed cracks with moss, animal hair, or whatever fibrous thing wasn't currently vital to someone's clothing. If it didn't move and wasn't immediately edible, it was probably insulation. Thicker quilts became prized heirlooms. Some were made from old clothing, including the tattered remains of soldiers' coats, wedding dresses, or an Uncle Silas mystery garment no one really discussed. They stitched these together not only to conserve fabric, but for warmth, and inadvertently pioneered what we now call upcycling. The result? Blankets so heavy and so thick they could double as siblings in a game of fort. And during the longest storms that blustered on for days and erased the horizon completely, families would hole in. This wasn't just a phrase. It was a minor architectural ritual involving blocking the chimney with stones or snow-packed cloth to keep heat in, banking fires so low they smouldered rather than flamed, and huddling together like human nesting, dolls under every layer of wool and flannel within reach. Food preparation, of course, required its own winter alchemy. Root vegetables were the quiet champions here, turnips and potatoes hulking in the cellar, stoically enduring like unpaid interns. But among the more curious traditions was the crafting of snowbound soup stones. Travellers, and perhaps one or two theatrical in-laws, who arrived during a storm might be met with a tale. "We're making soup from a stone." This, as you may know, was both a folktale and a ruse. Into the pot went a river stone, scrubbed, heated, plunked, followed closely by carrots, salted pork rinds, beans, onions, and herbs as available. By the time the magic stone had worked its fictional wonders, a hearty stew was brewing. It was pantry economy draped in fairy tale flair. Children marveled, guests chuckled, and the old stone was wiped clean and kept for next time. A reusable illusion. But not all survival came in such culinary flavors. Some were simply psychological. A deeply underrated settler survival trick was storytelling, though it was rarely called that. More often, it was talking until the sleet stops, or grandfather's dangerously long memory of the war. Some families passed nights in shared memory, weaving together past seasons like cramped but colourful patchwork, where every house creak had a tale, and every snowfall reminded someone of an even larger one in '09. Or was it '02? And then there was singing. Not rousing battle anthems or barroom shanties, but gentle, rhythmic tunes sung soft enough to be outmatched by the whistle of wind outside. They were lullabies for adults as much as children, stitched together from European melodies, indigenous influence, and whatever verses the occupants had half remembered from another time. Music filled the space between fireside and floorboards, between trapped weeks and spring dreams, sitting with mittens drying above the hearth in silence, nesting outside thicker than the ox-hide boots near the door. Settlers learned to regard time differently. Each day was a miniature season. Each hour a tether to another small act of warmth. One more handful of flour, one more shared joke, one more moment outsmarting the cold just long enough to yawn. And as midnight crept closer under layers of snow and story, the house itself, such as it was, became a kind of heartbeat. Creaking gently, ticking with drips of melting icicles, it held its inhabitants close like bark holds the sap. Of course, not all homes were created equal. Some settlers, whether by choice or necessity, built entirely differently someday. Let's drift now toward one such curious creation. A house made mostly of snow, and the cleverness required to keep it from becoming just another puddle. Out in the frostbitten folds of early colonial life, chores became rituals, and rituals became warm habits stitched together with steam, soot, and a dash of necessity. Winter's sharp-toothed wind howled outside as though auditioning for the role of night itself. But inside the settler's home, something oddly poetic was always afoot. You see, when it came to winding down after a day filled with breaking ice out of water buckets or coaxing reluctant stoves to life, settlers didn't have scented candles or alpaca fleece throws. They had hot bricks. Yes, baking hot bricks wrapped in flannel or old scraps of wool, tucked into beds like toasty little sleep goblins. These were called bed warmers, and they were the colonial equivalent of tucking in with an electric blanket, except laced with danger and soot. But long before wrapping bricks in cloth, someone had to get the fire up to snuff. Which brings us to a particularly treasured survival art form: firewood gathering. Not just gathering in the casual sense that implies a fall-themed walk in the woods, but more of a full-body opera of hatchets, sleds, wool mittens, and very cold noses. It wasn't just any tree you threw on the hearth. No. White oak was prized for its long, even burn, whereas poplar might warm your toes for 5 minutes before collapsing into a dramatic pile of chilly regret. There were debates over the perfect wood stack too. Colonial households had preferences for how their logs were arranged, some stacking east to west to avoid snow drifting between, others in circular cordwood cribs that looked a bit like rustic Stonehenges for squirrels. These stacks were utilitarian art installations that said, "We fight winter and we do it with symmetry." And when logs weren't enough, ingenuity took the stage. Enter the fireless cookers. Now, these were slow cookers before slow cookers were chic. A big pot of stew or porridge would be brought to a roiling bubble on the fire, then swaddled tightly in quilts and buried in hay boxes, insulated containers packed with straw, feathers, or whatever flammable fluff was up for the job. The retained heat would finish the cooking gently over several hours. The result was a bubbling pot of edible warmth, and occasionally a temptation for a curious chicken who mistook the hay box for high thread count bedding. Meals, by the way, weren't just nourishment. They were psychological armor. Brown bread made from molasses and cornmeal warmed both stomach and spirit. Root vegetables became the VIPs of winter, particularly when mashed, roasted, or turned into things vaguely described as puddings. Anything that could be kept from freezing without growing a worrisome fuzz earned a spot of respect on the scarred wooden dinner table. Even pickles enjoyed a sort of fermented celebrity status, regarded as little crunchy time capsules of warmer harvest days. Spices, when available, were worth more than gold, or at least more than uncooperative chickens. Settlers would eke out pinches of cinnamon, ginger, or nutmeg to make desserts out of practically nothing. A small handful of dried apples, a sprinkle of spice, and a careful bake inside the hearth would turn into something humble yet magical. They didn't call it apple slump because it was melancholy. It was because it slumped in the pan just right. The term slump in dessert parlance, after all, is truly the coziest sort of collapse. While the fire stayed crackling and smoke curled out the chimney like warm thoughts into a cold sky, evenings became their own sort of sacred. Knitting and mending filled many quiet hours, with needles clicking like murmuring crickets. If you were especially fortunate, you had a wool wheel, the sort that didn't just spin thread, but spun time itself. And come to think of it, colonial time seemed to move more slowly when snow blanketed everything, stitched the trees together in hush, and left only the sound of wind brushing against walls built with too many drafts and not enough insulation. Still, it worked somehow. Survival wasn't just in the food or the fire. It was in the rhythm. Wake, mend, eat, chop, stir, stitch, sleep. Wrap the kettle in wool, kiss it goodnight, and whisper something kind to the fire before it sighs into embers. And just past the crackling logs and the whispering looms, another humble trick was yet to be unravelled. One involving pewter spoons, candlelight, and the oddly warm magic of winter reading. One of the quietest tricks for surviving long winters on the frontier wasn't about firewood or snowshoes. It was about keeping secrets with sauerkraut. Now, if that sounds more like a grandmother's quiet rebellion than a survival tactic, you're not far off. Early settlers, especially in colder climates like the New England colonies and the Great Lakes region, learned quickly that fresh vegetables were a summer luxury and a winter myth. Potatoes could be stored, of course. Cabbage was hardy enough to overwinter in root cellars. But if you wanted something to keep you truly sprightly in spirit and not entirely scurvy-ridden by February, you had to turn to fermentation, nature's slow, fizzy magic trick. Settlers didn't always understand why fermented cabbage kept them from developing mysterious jaw pain and bleeding gums, but they knew it worked. That briny jar of sauerkraut in the back corner of the pantry wasn't just a garnish for salt pork. It was a quiet, crunchy guardian against nutritional collapse. Families would gather around wooden barrels in cool barns or back porches with sleeves rolled up, methodically layering chopped cabbage with salt, stomping it down with clean boots or fists, releasing the juices, and tucking it lovingly under a wooden weight. Then, they'd clap a cloth over it like tucking in a sleepy child and leave nature to do her bubbling, fizzing duty. The fermentation process didn't just preserve food, it gave people something to talk about in January, besides whether or not the roof would collapse under the snow. Sauerkraut became a topic of passionate debate. Who salted too much? Who stomped too vigorously? Whose kraut had gone mysteriously blue and unappetizing? It was frontier gossip, with a pungent bouquet. Meanwhile, in the colder Scandinavian settlements, a cousin to sauerkraut reigned. Pickled fish, cod, herring, and the occasional creature one hesitates to call edible were preserved in salt, brine, or vinegar and eaten cold over flatbread with a shrug and a look that said, "We do what we must." Back in more forested regions, settlers leaned heavily on root cellars. If you've never stood inside a root cellar during a snowstorm, imagine a chilly hobbit hole where vegetables go to nap, dug into the earth with careful consideration of airflow and drainage, and occasionally a superstitious nail hammered over the entrance to ward off mold goblins. These spaces were dark, humbly cold, and full of treasures. Carrots the size of a toddler's arm, beets that looked more like murder evidence than nourishment, and parsnips, humble, pale, sweetly spicy parsnips that could sneak their way into pies when apples ran out and no one dared admit the difference. There was a certain reverence about grabbing something from the root cellar, a dignified gratitude that said, "Thank you, bulbous root vegetable, for surviving the long months of frost and fungal threat." This was not snack food. This was slow, whispery survival. Settlers also preserved apples by slicing them into rings and stringing them like necklaces for kitchen ghosts. These wrinkled apple slices hung by fireplaces or from beams, gently swaying in the rising warm air, drying into soft little discs of chewable memories. And behind it all, there was always a bit of mystery. Why did Amelia's pickled turnips fizz more than usual this year? Why did the apples shrivel too far, too quickly, like a cautionary tale of vanity? Winter preservation, for all its science and spirit, remained something of a whisper between the living and the food gods. In this quiet competition of craft and patience, a clever settler might become legendary, not for braving a blizzard, but for curing the ham with just the right ratio of smoke to maple, or for discovering that leaving rutabagas near the wall of the root cellar created just the right chill to keep them sprightly into March, or, in the case of a certain particularly experimental widow in western Pennsylvania, for pressing elderberries into wine while no one was looking. and quietly bartering it for firewood that kept her warm all winter. Preservation wasn't just a matter of survival. It was an art form painted in salt, air, vinegar, and time. Quiet, patient magic conducted in barrels, jars, and dim earthen spaces, always humming softly behind the crackle of the fire. And just beyond the pantry door, where the wind hissed against the shutters and the world slept underneath its quilt of white, another, even older trick waited patiently for its turn. How to heat a cabin when the stove burns out and the night is long as a fable. If you had wandered up to a settler's cabin during the thick of a January blizzard and politely knocked on the frosted door, assuming you made it past the waist-deep snow and the wolf tracks circling like curious punctuation, you'd probably have had to wait a while. Not because they were screening their visitors, although that may have been part of it, but mostly because the average homesteader during a storm was tucked somewhere deep in their home, under at least 7 layers of blankets, 3 layers of regret, and possibly cradling a ladle of steaming squirrel stew. By this point in the winter, food supplies weren't so much dwindling as they were staging a slow and sullen exit. The salted pork that once looked plump and promising now resembled a leather shoe, and the last apple was being saved for a family birthday cake in May. Yet somehow they endured. One often overlooked winter survival strategy: waiting. Yes, just good old-fashioned, stubborn waiting. Settlers called it lying low, which was a much cozier term for we're not freezing to death today if we can help it. And lying low required a level of passive determination that could only come from knitting by candlelight, while your toes slowly forgot what warmth was. While outside the wind howled like a banshee in mourning, inside the hearth was more than a heat source. It was the family's best friend. Enter the art of fire tending, which modern people might mistake for poking things with a stick. It was, in fact, a full-time job. The hearth had to be fed just right, not too much, unless you wanted to smoke out Grandma again, and not too little, lest frost sneak its shimmering fingers in through the cracks in the walls. Ashes were used cleverly. A thick bed of white ash could keep an ember alive until morning, a kind of fire insurance policy for those wise enough not to press their luck against a pre-dawn freeze. The clever among them also practiced one of the most poetic traditions of settler winters: nighttime storytelling. This was not merely a charming fireside tradition. It was psychological insulation, a homemade distraction from the thumps and groans of snow-laden roofs and the ever-present indifference of weather. And oh, the stories, tales woven from memory, suspicion, and at least 2 cups of exaggeration. Stories of wolves disguised as men, of men disguised as wolves, of mysterious lights in the trees, usually explained later by drunken uncles with lanterns, and midnight encounters with old ghosts that tugged at coat hems or stole biscuits meant for guests. Children listened with wide eyes, not from fear exactly, but rather because grandfather had a tendency to slip into wild tangents involving lost treasure, secret tunnels beneath the barn, and that time he chased off a bear using only a slipper and an unsettling musical whistle. Of course, in the quieter hours of the long stretches between snowstorms, some settlers practiced a crude but effective form of indoor exercise: house repairs. Nothing stirs the soul like hammering a loose board back into place at 2 a.m, while muttering curses about who thought this was a good place for a wall. It wasn't CrossFit, but it certainly counted. In smaller cabins, people shared body heat beneath enormous patchwork quilts, many of which included highly questionable stitching of animals so abstract The family dog couldn't decide whether to feel flattered or offended. These quilts were stitched earlier in the year by hands warm from summer sun, and always included a square labelled "just in case." Just in case of what, no one exactly said. Even the chamber pot earned begrudging appreciation in these months. Though few songs were written in praise of the humble urine bucket, it was undeniably better than venturing out into 20 below winds simply to relieve oneself with a snowdrift as your only audience. But for all the grumbling and frostbitten toes, there was also undeniable camaraderie in these lean months. The winter pulled people inward, physically, emotionally, spiritually, often jammed into one room with only tallow smoke and shared heat to get by. Enemies softened, jokes got recycled, secrets were spilled like soup onto the floorboards, and somehow the threat outside made the inside a kind of sacred space. As the storm raged on, the cabin breathed like a sleeping creature, protected, bearded with icicles, and still. Soon the days would inch longer, but for now the settlers practiced patience, tucked away from the howling wind, wrapped in wool, whispers, and well-worn stories. And just as one tale ends, another begins. A curious incident involving a frozen boot, a missing pie, and the most suspicious set of footprints anyone had ever seen. Winter in the early settlements was not some scenic postcard of sleigh rides and twinkling snowflakes. It was more like prolonged character development, an unbroken snow globe of grey skies, frozen animals, and loneliness so thick it could be buttered and served with sorrow biscuits. But our resourceful ancestors, ever adept at quiet adapting, had their ritual comforts, quiet tricks not taught in schools, but passed in whispers between frostbitten generations. And nothing encapsulated this folkloric wisdom quite like the curious invention known simply as the foot stove. Now, don't let the word stove fool you into imagining anything large, iron-bound, or remotely efficient. A foot stove was, in practice, a fiery lunchbox for your toes. Crafted of wood and tin, it resembled a picnic basket designed by someone who really missed their fireplace. Inside was a small metal pan for live coals, slotted in carefully, perhaps prayerfully, by someone determined not to let their feet become historical artifacts. Church services, you see, were an Arctic affair in colonial New England. There was piety, there were psalms, there was often a 3-hour sermon, and there was absolutely no indoor heating. Worshippers would drag their foot stoves beneath the pews, huddling over them like penguins at prayer. You'd catch a faint scent of charred splinters and singed wool, a few hopeful toes wriggling near the glow. You prayed for salvation, but also for circulation. And it bears mentioning, the communal stove warming etiquette could get dicey. One outspoken but frostbitten Quaker in 1742 was reportedly rebuked mid-sermon for aggressively poaching someone else's embers. There was no harder proof of human frailty than stealing heat during a homily. In domestic life, settlers went to surprisingly poetic lengths to conserve warmth. Families would gather in what they called the keeping room, usually the only heated space in a house populated by whatever life hadn't already frozen solid. We're talking spindly cats, half-defrosted pies, grandparents bundled like upholstered furniture, and children emitting the tired energy of overcooked dumplings. At night, sharing a bed wasn't just about space, it was about survival. And cuddling was tactical. Entire families, sometimes including distant cousins, livestock infants, and a lucky potato, don't ask, might sleep in the same bed. It wasn't romantic, but it was certainly warm, and the phrase, "don't hog the covers," took on diplomatic gravity. There were zones, there were treaties, another largely unsung hero of frigid frontier life. Onion poultices, yes. The noble onion, previously just known for ruining everyone's breath and romantic opportunities, became the go-to cure for nearly everything from coughs to cold feet. Sliced, sautéed, or simply smashed into a semi-gelatinous misery paste, onions were applied to chests and socks with the solemn hope that sulfuric vegetables might coax vitality back into the human frame. And then, of course, there was the curious institution of the warming pan, a sort of colonial curling iron for your mattress. Long-handled pans filled with hot coals swirled between the bed sheets minutes before one retired. An elegant flourish in theory, though in practice, early warming pans caused an uncomfortable number of bed fires and accidental smouldering of nightcaps. One diary entry from 1721 reads, "Mother claims warming pan comforts her greatly until she scorched her toe and accused it of witchcraft." Another more serene habit developed during long winters was storytelling, especially during the endless evenings swaddled in candlelight and mutual fatigue. Fireside tales were less about frightening ghosts and more about surviving grievances, neighborly spats, a cow with a death wish, or the time someone's husband accidentally misread a seed catalogue and planted 12 rows of turnips instead of 12 types of vegetables. These tales, while simple, were threaded with quiet wit and family memory. Over time, they shaped a peculiar humor, one born not of abundance, but of shared absurdity. Because sometimes, when the snow was too deep, the bread too stale, and the dog more sensible than everyone else, laughter was the most efficient form of central heating. As the storm clouds hunkered down for another week, and the blizzards hummed their endless lullabies against window panes, the settlers leaned inward, to fires, to stories, to each other. And in that ragtag warmth, they built something sturdier than brick, resilience wrapped in shared silliness. Now then, as we quietly leave the gentle glow of those coal-lit foot stoves and onion-scented bedtime rituals, let's softly step toward the age-old art of winter chores, or, as colonial children knew it, a festive avalanche of discomfort disguised as character building. Back in those white-dusted winters when the sun rose late and gave up early, early settlers found themselves inventing new forms of ingenuity while semi-frozen and deeply bored. One favorite frontier pastime was something called complementary inconveniences, when one unbearable thing balanced out another in a way that almost resembled comfort. For instance, take the outhouse. No one in their right, or even mildly skewed, mind wanted to hike to the splinter-happy toilet shed during a howling snowstorm at midnight. So families assigned what some affectionately, and others not so affectionately, called a night chamberlain, usually the youngest child, or whoever owed the most favors. This unfortunate soul had the honor of holding the chamber pot for any older relative brave enough to ask. And while not exactly hygienic by modern standards, or by any standard really, it did mean one less face full of sleet by moonlight. Balance misery. That was the magic. Some settlers even argued that spiritual warmth could offset physical cold. Hence, the development of salon sermons, tiny family services held around the fireplace that blended psalm reading with excessive commentary on Mrs. Dawson's overcooked venison pies. After all, God was in the details, and apparently so was Margaret, who never missed a chance to bring up how charred game is an affront to righteousness. And while early Americans didn't yet have Netflix to binge, they had something arguably better: stories passed down 3, 5-10 times per winter, until they mutated like snowflakes under boots. There was always the tale about Cousin Thomas, who once lit his beard trying to read a letter too close to the fire, or the family yarn about Grandfather Elijah, who allegedly built an entire sled team out of mildly cooperative goats. Did it work? No. Was it memorable? Extremely. Contrary to myth, boredom didn't kill most settlers. It merely forged new neural pathways paved with ingenuity and questionable hobbies. One such invention was butter churning races. See, milk was precious, time was flexible, and any excuse to bet a pickled carrot was seized upon. The rules were simple. Churn until your arms gave out, or until someone passed out from laughter. It's unclear who usually won, but the butter often ended up on the walls. For indoor insulation, settlers discovered a secret surprisingly cozy: old newspapers and dried moss stuffed into every crevice imaginable. Cabin walls, boots, bed pillows, even sleeves acquired bonus insulation this way. It was tactile recycling at its finest. Reading last May's pig auction results while stuffing moss into your socks might not sound glamorous, but it had a quiet charm when augmented by the scent of simmering onion stew and the sound of the wind losing arguments with the window shutters. Sleep, like food and fire, was a precious resource, and winter sleep had a rhythm of its own. With darkness stretched to painterly lengths, people often practiced a curious habit documented in several 17th and 18th century diaries: segmented sleep. They went to bed shortly after dusk, rose around midnight for a few hours of quiet activity, meditation, storytelling, light mending, and then returned to what was sweetly termed their second sleep. It seems some of us were meant to be night owls after all, just quietly, without screens, and in an overgrown nightgown. Even courtship adapted to the season. Imagine two would-be suitors, each competing to see who could carve the better spoon out of birchwood. Love, it turns out, could be whittled. Likewise, so-called bundling customs, where a courting couple was allowed to sleep in the same bed, fully clothed, with a wooden board between them, could only have arisen during winters robust enough to collapse social inhibitions, but not warm enough to remove the pine divider. It was romance with a draft. The most powerful survival trick, though, the real secret, was simply ritual. Every night had its tiny ceremonies. Placing a hot brick in the bed's footbox, retelling the best part of the day, even if it was just discovering a raccoon hadn't stolen the last oatcake, and humming a familiar melody used so often it practically became furniture. Settlers may have lacked central heating, but they layered their days with repetition and meaning. Quilted routines stitched with small absurdities, and the warmth of shared breath in cold rooms. And so, as another snow-thick night wound onward, with logs cracking softly in the hearth like heavy punctuation, families grew drowsy under furs and patchwork quilts, lulled by the mumble of wind outside and the comfort of knowing that survival, however inconvenient, had a rhythm after all. In the quiet of that rhythm, something curious was stirring downstairs, the result of a flickering candle too near a pantry shelf. But that, as it turns out, is a tale for next time. By late January, even the most optimistic settlers, those who'd arrived brimming with dreams of abundant farmland and fresh air that smelled of promise, had to admit that nature had a flair for dramatic irony. The romantic ideal of snow-dusted log cabins quickly lost its glow when snow began drifting its way through ill-fitted roofs, and the ink froze solid in the family Bible. You see, winter was less a season and more a house guest who overstayed their welcome. Quiet, heavy-footed, and always rearranging your furniture just when you got used to where it was. And while today's winters often arrive with notifications and decorative scarves, for the early settlers, they arrived unannounced, without warning or Wi-Fi. One of the quieter tricks to surviving these long winters wasn't found in brute strength or daring heroism. No, it was found in a far humbler place, the pantry shelf. Root cellars, in fact, those slightly spooky, dirt-floored under-earth pantries, were the true winter lodestars. Dug deep into hillsides or nestled beneath cabins, they were nature's refrigerator long before electricity began bossing ice around. Settlers grew root vegetables not out of some ironic vintage aesthetic, but because beets, carrots, and turnips were shockingly obedient when asked to sit quietly underground for several months and not expire. Whole cabbages were wrapped in cloth like old china and stacked with scientific precision. Potatoes were handled like moody aristocrats. Keep them cool, dry, and never expose them to too much light, lest they turn green and indignant. It wasn't just what you stored, it was how you stored it. Meat, for example, saw more action off the animal than on it. Ham was smoked and hung in rafters like particularly well-preserved ghosts. Fat was rendered into lard, which then moonlighted as everything from cooking oil to candle fuel to the occasional hair treatment. Yes, if you ever wondered how our ancestors survived a winter blizzard, the answer, disturbingly often, was by being greased up and well salted. Helping matters was the humble fireplace, a contraption that served as heater, stove, storyteller, relationship counselor, and light source, all rolled into one. But firewood was another matter entirely. It had to be split and stacked in absurdly large pyramids during the golden months of autumn, lest you find yourself burning furniture legs come February. Many a family heirloom met its match this way, sacrificed to the god of warmth. There goes Aunt Bessie's wedding chair, someone might have sighed, as it popped merrily in the flames. But what really made these winters bearable, apart from thermal layering and strategic napping, was the delicate art of being still. Settlers adopted a kind of winter rhythm, a slow, syrupy cadence of life, which others might call hibernation, but they preferred to think of as intentional stillness. Children played games made from household scraps and ghost stories recycled through generations. Adults mended shoes, reread the same 3 books aloud, and occasionally held contests to see who could guess what day it actually was. Spoiler, they were often wrong, but it passed the time. Even needlework, a famously quiet pursuit, became its own form of meditation. Women stitched samplers not only to practice their skill, but to send little messages into the darkness. Sleep soft, work hard, one quilt might suggest. God bless this house and all frozen toes within, whispered another. Some nights were given over entirely to listening to the groan of the cabin as it settled deeper into the frost, to the long howls of wind weaving through tree limbs like a fiddler chasing a melody he half remembered. The quiet could be unnerving. It had a texture to it. But after enough days bundled together, humans adjusted, as they tend to. They learned to fill that quiet with whispered jokes and long silences that only made sense to those who shared them. These weren't the grand fire-lit sagas often sung in the tales. These were quiet, domestic victories of not freezing, solid, of scraping a meal together without anyone losing a finger to frostbite or tempers to too many rounds of checkers. In a world where everyday survival required orchestration as quiet as snowfall, the settlers became artists of preparation, curators of calm. And in their own slow-burning way, they discovered peace nestled between the logs of the woodpile and the lull of snow against shutters. Of course, as the fire burned low and the cold pressed harder against the walls, there were still challenges ahead. But before we tiptoe into the next flickering scene, into the matters of melting snow and melted tempers, let us linger here a while longer. Listening to the wind write poetry we'll pretend to understand. By the time mid-February arrived, with the sky smeared grey like oversteeped tea and snow drifting sideways like a sleepy ghost stage curtain, early settlers had long since grown used to what I like to call strategic gloom. This was the phase when many a pioneer no longer asked, "Will it snow today?" but rather, how many different ways can snow fall before it becomes some kind of silent performance art? And somehow, despite the bitter wind whistling through doors, bravely pretending to be sealed, these settlers had tricks, quiet little triumphs, that made survival less about stoicism and more about clever, low-effort genius. Take, for instance, the great and noble art of the foot oven. A wooden box with a tray of hot coals slipped beneath your feet, often hidden under a quilt like a scandalous secret. Churches and parlours alike saw these small warming contraptions nestled at the feet of those who'd mastered the skill of pretending they weren't slowly freezing. One simply warmed their toes, tucked a smirk behind a shawl, and nodded along to sermons or discussions with all the elegance of a person whose extremities were not mildly dying. Inventive, yes. Highly flammable. Historically, questionably, but effective, absolutely. Meanwhile, for those not inclined to risk combustion beneath their blankets, settlers turned toward a more sustainable solution. Animals as live, portable space heaters. Chickens might roost in kitchen corners, dogs curled up like steaming meatloafs by hearthstones. And yes, even the particularly docile farm goats found themselves the unlikely stars of a cuddling session or two. They were warm, quiet, and rarely complained, unless denied snacks. The concept of sleeping with livestock, of course, has long borne an unfairly uncivilized reputation. But in times of howling blizzards and single-digit temperatures, cozy was cozy. And few things bond a family quite like waking up to the surprise bleat of a goat sharing your pillow. Food, what was left of it, also transformed into layered expressions of winter discipline. Pies, for example, were not just desserts, they were storage strategies. A meat pie could hide root vegetables like secrets tucked under a flowery blanket. And dried, apples re-emerged like shriveled treasure, softened into stews or boiled in rum until they remembered their former lives. Sometimes, when supplies grew thin and spirits thinner, the settlers turned to a culinary marvel known as slump. Despite sounding like something your coat does when you hang it wrong, slump was a steamed fruit dessert, like a cobbler with low self-esteem. Nevertheless, it was warm, sweetish, and just soft enough to remind you that pudding is a mood, not just a food, and moods, thank heavens, could be edible. In these darkest weeks, light itself became an emotional variable. Candles, carefully hoarded, were burned not only to read or sew, but for the sheer spectacle of something, anything, glowing with enthusiasm. The candle would sputter heroically on the windowsill, offering neighbors across the frostbitten void a glimpse that someone else too was awake and determined not to despair into a snowbank. Meanwhile, children, less interested in despair, more interested in making mischief, turned cabin fever into a noisy art form. Left to entertain themselves with limited supervision, they invented games where buttons were currency, pine cones were livestock, and any adult snoring in a rocking chair became a potential mountain to be climbed. What they lacked in toys, they gained in elaborate narratives often narrated by the family's slightly senile uncle in a voice suspiciously borrowed from his Civil War memoirs. Families who could read or had access to a single book inevitably read that book many, many times, until its pages felt more like old friends and the characters seemed like folks you might bump into at the trading post. More than one household admitted to holding dramatic readings of Robinson Crusoe or Pilgrim's Progress by firelight, part theatre, part coping mechanism, and fully sanctioned by the lack of anything else to do. Of course, none of these things solved the winter. They simply eased it, softened the blow with a woolly edge. These quiet tricks stitched together the weeks in ways no amount of snow could truly unravel. And just when the icy days began to feel eternal, their grip tightening like the world's slowest bear hug, something peculiar and marvelous would happen. A shift in the wind, a slightly different looking sunrise, the faintest drip of meltwater down a porch beam. But that, dear listener, is a story for a gentler morning. It was during the longest stretches of winter, when the snowdrifts buried fences and the clouds hung over the land like a sulking quilt, that early settlers turned to the most curious kind of survival trick, the art of stationary mischief. Yes, remaining still, yet brilliantly subversive. You see, when daylight was short and the wind too rude for extended tasks, some settlers decided it was time to win the psychological war against the storm. This wasn't survival by firewood or dried soup. No, this was survival by cleverness, by outwitting the elements at their own game through deeply impractical crafts, suspiciously obsessive organization, and games that made no sense to anyone, including the players. One such pastime that quietly swept through snowed-in homesteads was competitive button counting. The idea sounds dull, and you'd be absolutely right. But in the middle of February, in a cabin where one had memorized the grain of every wall plank, the button jar became a thrilling vortex of arithmetic and mild deception. Folks would gather around a table lit by a single oil lamp and lay odds on Aunt Prudence miscounting her spinner button tally for the third night in a row. Another sophisticated strategy was what came to be known, at least unofficially, as the Kitchen Relocation Initiative. This is when an entire family, usually led by a bored patriarch overcome with theoretical energy, decided the kitchen simply had to move 6 feet to the left. Chairs were rebuilt, shelves were reshelved backwards. Flour, buckets were reassigned, new pegs were whittled for mugs that never asked for new pegs. The stove might remain if kindly bribed. By March, the family would often quietly slide everything back into its original spot and pretend nothing had happened. But during those storms, it gave everyone purpose and just enough chaos to feel slightly alive again. In regions with a bit more elbow room and a well-fed cow or two, settlers dabbled in snow baking. This wasn't baking in the snow, mind you, but baking for the snow. Bread sculptures were left in the drifts, much to the confusion of foraging squirrels and passing relatives. One Vermont gentleman famously baked a 3-tier cake in January 1811 and served it exclusively to icicles hanging from his shed, all named after theoretical future children. It kept his spirits up and his neighbors distant, which suited him fine. Children, meanwhile, were tasked with safety sprinting, an activity that involved running from one snow pile to another in under 10 seconds while wearing at least 2 too many scarves. It may or may not have improved their circulation, but it certainly tired them out, which was the real objective. As any winter-weary parent knows, wearing out one's offspring by mid-afternoon was an act of both self-care and high strategy. The real champions were able to get kids to shovel the entire animal path by framing it as a snow obstacle championship. History never quite recorded the medal tally. And then there was the quietest trick of all, the storytelling hour. Long before podcasts or streaming television, families used their most powerful survival tool, a well-told tale. Neighbors would exchange stories the way people now swap passwords for streaming services. And while some stories were grand epics filled with foxes who turned into fiddlers, most leaned on the warmth of familiarity. Grandpa's slightly exaggerated tale about an exploding jam jar, or the mystery of which Aunt once slept through an entire barn fire and woke up asking for tea. These tales became the insulation between hearts when walls no longer held in the heat. The trick to surviving those storms, settlers discovered, wasn't just doing more. It was sometimes about doing differently, distracting the mind, tickling the soul, marching the hours forward with just enough humor to keep from drifting into despair. It was a quiet magic, cast not with spells, but with potato stamp games, split pea art installations, and elaborate calico theft investigations involving the family cat. And as the days inched toward light, and the frost of winter began to loosen its stiff grip, even the silliest survival tricks were remembered fondly, as if the blizzard had been an odd guest, one that lingered too long but taught everyone how to create warmth without more fire. There was one trick, however, that remained a secret weapon among the coziest homesteads, one that didn't involve buttons, bread, or enthusiastic rearrangement of kitchen tools. But that, dear dreamer, will have to wait for a gentler evening breeze. Even the frost had learned to knock politely at the windows by now, too tired to keep howling. Winter had settled into the bones of the land, and everyone, man, beast, and sourdough starter alike, had learned to adopt a kind of polite stillness. By late February, early settlers in the northern colonies had devised an entire etiquette for enduring the long, frilly boredom of winter's epilogue. See, surviving the cold wasn't just about keeping warm. No. It was about keeping peace, preserving pickles, and pretending your brother-in-law's snoring didn't sound like a steam engine negotiating a moral crisis. The hearth had long ceased to be merely a fire space. It was now the spiritual center of the universe. Soup bubbling gently, a whole onion sliced ceremoniously into its depths once a week, like some kind of vegetable baptism. And everyone, from the baby to the cat to old Uncle Justus, who may or may not have been asleep since Boxing Day, cradled mugs or knitting or each other in a sleepy, wool-wrapped domino line. One quiet habit that helped keep minds soft and hearts warmer than the fire itself was binding books. No, not reading them. Not yet. That's that's later. Bookbinding was a pastime as slow and meditative as watching tree rings form. Paper was precious, mind you. Settlers scraped together old merchant bills, sermon drafts, or letters from that one cousin who wrote like he was being paid by the sentence. They'd sew them together with flaxen twine, press them under flat stones or sleepy toddlers, and adorn the covers with scraps of rag cloth stiffened with flour paste. The oldest among them said that the act of making a book was the same as keeping a garden in your mind. And in this weather, that sounded like a fine idea. Meanwhile, food creativity reached a kind of dignified desperation. There were still jars to open, rhubarb preserves, pickled cucumbers, and something ambiguously labeled July chow, which may have been fruit, may have been fish, and may have been medicinal. The flavor profile was referred to as eventful, but no one had perished, and that was the point. The real hero, though, was the root cellar, a humbly dug hole beneath the house, or sometimes, in the early days, what was the house? Vegetables that had been carefully stored in sand or sawdust now emerged like lumpy aristocrats returning from a sabbatical. Potatoes with eyes turned skyward, carrots curled into shy question marks, and turnips. So many turnips. The poor things had carried the culinary weight of 3 straight months, and were, at this point, treated with the reverence of elder statesmen. It was also around this time when the acoustic fate of the cabin became clear. Between the winds whistling through the chinks in the log walls and the bi-weekly roof thud from falling snow, the cabin creaked and sighed like a ship at sea. Every house had its own language. Floorboards communicated in groans. Ladder stairs communicated in confessions and regrets. Even the chilblains on Mrs. Hargrave's hands had developed a kind of Morse code. Mostly gripes about the lack of ginger snaps. Evenings blurred into reverie, aided and abetted by the quiet arts. Braiding rugs, darning socks, whittling increasingly intricate squirrels, starting a 5th game of who took the last bit of lard, and pretending no one remembered the answer. These were the rituals, the sacred rhythms of indoor survival. And while some may have associated winter with frostbite or livestock ennui, the settlers came to treat it almost like a visiting monarch, demanding, yes, but so grand it made daily life feel like a noble performance. Children, bored out of their woolen minds, made dolls out of corn husks and emotional subtext. They reenacted folk tales, improvised puppet plays, and, on rare occasions, accidentally invented something remarkably close to modern interpretive dance. Yet despite the cold, nothing chilled the spirit permanently. Settlers had an odd, contagious habit of laughing into adversity. Not loudly, of course, because the baby was sleeping and the windows had ears, but softly, around the fire, snorting intermittents as someone retold the story of the time Reverend Thomas mistook a sleeping hog for the sermon bench. And so, another day whitened into another night. Snowflakes continued their slow parade past the lamplight. Outside, the wind coiled through trees like it had somewhere to be. But inside, in here, the silence was softer, padded with stories, sandwiches, and endless mittens, slightly damp at the thumbs. Tomorrow, they'd attempt the ceremonial act of making candles from tallow and ill-advised optimism. But tonight, they simply leaned back, letting their eyes close gently as the hearth flickered like an ancient lullaby. And somewhere in the lull of the logs, a new idea began to unfurl, one born not of survival, but of comfort. The beginnings of a tradition, with warm socks and well-earned naps. As the wind howled like an opera soprano lost in the woods, sharp, dramatic, and just a touch too enthusiastic, early settlers huddled close to their hearths, wrapped in wool, silence, and the occasional complaint about the draft. But one of the quietest, most genius acts of surviving the long, tireless winters wasn't about building fires or chopping wood at heroic angles. No, it was about the unsung art of making boredom bearable. Because here's the thing, winter wasn't just cold. It was long, exceptionally uneventful, and kept folks inside cabins the size of contemporary walk-in closets. If you've ever tried staying cheerful inside a log cube with no indoor plumbing, 6 of your closest relatives, and a single candle, you get the idea. So settlers became master distractors. Their methods, utterly splendid in their simplicity. Take, for example, the humble toe dance, performed under 3 layers of socks, seated by the fire, and accompanied by a narration from someone who'd gone slightly snow crazy. It wasn't meant to be seen, fortunately, but it was an excellent way to fend off frostbite and family feuds. Knitting, too, became the season's jam, not because everyone was craving hand-woven socks, though no one ever turned them down, but because counting stitches with one eye half closed was as close to meditation as one could get with a toddler chewing on kindling nearby. Entire scarves were crafted simply to pass the time between blizzards. In the fashion hierarchy of the frontier, a scarf woven out of pure boredom ranked surprisingly high. And then there were stories. Not written down. Parchment was a luxury, ink even more so, but passed mouth to mouth like steaming bowls of stew. Winter unlocked an oral tradition with roughly the same energy as a Victorian soap opera. There were tales of lost treasure, suspiciously cooperative bears, and kindly ghosts who helped with the cooking. If the teller's imagination happened to invent a magical raccoon that solved disputes with tap dancing, well, no one objected, least of all the children, who now had a reason to imagine something other than icicles. Some settler households even played a rudimentary form of trivia. It was usually someone's mother asking, "What day is it again?" and everyone else realizing they had absolutely no idea. Time had frozen over, as solid as the creek, and no one cared much. It was always snow day, and that was enough. Interestingly, settlers also relied on what modern folks might call cozy rituals. Each night, someone would carve one new notch into the fireplace mantle, not to track time precisely, but to create a sense of rhythm, a reminder that the days, however indistinct, were still moving forward. Some days got a double notch if the porridge turned out extra thick or a squirrel was spotted looking confused by the wind. Joy is relative in a blizzard. Camaraderie, too, was an act of survival. Folk would look out the window, see nothing but grey-white infinity, and say things like, "Well, looks like it's brightening up," as a form of optimistic denial. Humour, especially the kind that ran dry and looped back around to funny again, was more essential than salt pork. A favourite winter joke went something like this. What did the snow-covered log say to the settler? Nothing, because it was a log. Cue the laughter, or something close to it. Cabin fever has low standards, and so they existed in this quiet choreography. Knit, sip, nod, repeat. The fire smoked, the snow whispered, and even the drafty corners of the cabin seemed to exhale stories. It was not an action tale. It was survival by subtlety, by soft perseverance, by finding warmth wherever it could be coaxed. Be it from a crackling flame, a shared blanket, or a story told so many times it gained the comfort of truth, whether it ever really happened or not. Eventually, the storm would pass. The sun would return like a shy guest, peeking in, finding everything just as it left it, but warmer somehow, held together by threads of patience. And what came next? Well, as another whispered tale began to form on winter-chapped lips, we'll pull our blanket a little tighter and drift forward, together. By the final stretch of the frost season, the settlers had become less like colonists and more like winter itself. Quiet, persistent, occasionally drifting, and very good at staying in one place. Their boots bore permanent outlines of fireplace ash. Their mittens smelled faintly of onions and desperation, and their homes creaked with secrets that only timber and candlelight had time for. Winter, in those old wooden cabins, didn't end with a dramatic thaw. It simply forgot to keep snowing. Icicles fell off the eaves one morning with soft thuds, like clumsy punctuation at the end of a long sentence. Days lengthened one blink at a time, and the crust of snow grew pockmarked with mystery puddles. This strange new world hinted at audacious ideas, like opening a window, or astonishingly, walking barefoot for 6 seconds before regretting it entirely. By now, the trick had become less about surviving and more about waiting politely for nature to let them stretch their legs. The late winter settlers were suspicious optimists. They'd peeled their turnips with the steady resignation of monks and sown an unspoken pact with the February wind. We'll endure if you don't blow the roof off. These people knew things city folk will never understand. For instance, they knew how to read smoke. Not metaphorically, though winter did lend itself to excessive metaphors, but quite literally. If your chimney smoke billowed low and sideways, it foretold a snow squall. If it rose in a straight, elegant column, bragging rights, that sweet vertical line meant calm skies, or, at worst, a polite flurry. Settlers would stand outside like tired 18th century weather vanes, squinting at their own smoke with deep scientific concentration. Their conclusions were often accompanied by the world's most solemn tea and an occasional biscuit not fully distinguishable from a rock. And then there was cabin talk, that quiet social hum that filled the blank spaces of endless evenings, composed of half-told stories, habitual lies about past summers, and elaborate debates about whether spotted beet stew was poison or merely unfortunate. Cabin talk was ritual, just structured enough to delay madness, but lawless enough to let stories wander into improbable territories. It's how children came to believe foxes could count to 7 and grandfathers could hypnotize frost with a glare. By spring's doorstep, every object in the cabin had become emotionally charged. The ladle had a personality. The doormat was a veteran. Even the firewood pile, once a background character, now felt like distant family you only visited when things got grim. People had quarrels with chairs and reconciled with petticoats. One settler wrote 17 letters to a spoon. Put plainly, they were ready. So when the first honest stream of meltwater whispered down from the roof, it was received like a spiritual visitor. No fanfare, just long, private looks among residents, as if to say, "Did you hear that?" Then, like people diffusing a prank by nature, they waited 3 more days, just to be sure. And then finally, soft shoes outside, a stroll down the dirt path that had impersonated a glacier for 4 months. Hens blinked and squawked at the daylight, as though they'd been resurrected. The snow pudding surrenders to mud, that timeless springtime dish. The game of not freezing had been won, again. No one celebrated out loud. It wasn't their style. They just did things, ordinary, glorious, unstrained things. They fetched water without building a small war against a frozen well. They slept with 1 blanket fewer, proud but cautious. And in a moment of wild luxury, birchwood was burned not because it was necessary, but because they liked the smell. The settlers don't have statues. They barely have headstones. But their quiet choreography, how they moved through the cabin, fed the fire, patched a boot, stirred soup while watching the window curtain lift ever so slightly. That's where you'll find the real history, hidden in the rituals, tucked beneath wool layers, never heroic, just practiced resilience. And so, the storm seasons melted into memory again, and the settlers, weary and a little wiser, stepped into the sunlight that once felt like folklore. They didn't say much. They just leaned against the doorway, sipped something warm, and let the birds do the talking. Shh, that's the end of this journey. You've traveled far tonight, over frostbitten fields and through candle-lit evenings of long-forgotten survival tricks. And now, the hearth is low. The wind outside finally feels gentle, and the snow has, at last, stopped whispering. Time now to rest.